Shafiq Adas, considered the wealthiest Jew in Iraq, was hanged outside his Basra mansion on September the 23rd, 1948, after a kangaroo court found him guilty of treason and aiding the Zionist enemy. His execution sent shockwaves throughout the millennia-old Jewish community in Iraq, and is mentioned together with the 1941 pogrom of the Farhud as a main reason for the hurried 1950-51 Jewish exodus from Iraq. At a time when anti-Semitic tropes in the West are used against the Jewish state, accusing it of being white, colonialist and imperialist, the Adas affair could serve as a strong rebuttal of the anti-Zionist narrative and remind us that Jews are native to the Middle East and that it was not Ashkenazi European Zionism that ruined a fictitious Jewish-Muslim harmony. Adi Schwartz is a researcher, lecturer and author focusing on issues relating to Jewish and Israeli history and to the Arab-Israeli conflict. He is the co-author of The War of Return: How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. He is an expert on the history of Jews from Arab countries and the Palestinian refugee problem. He is a fellow at the Centre for International Communications in Bar-Ilan University and a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy.
So today's speaker is Dr. Adi Schwartz. Dr. Adi Schwartz is a researcher, lecturer, and author focusing on issues relating to Jewish and Israeli history and to the Arab-Israeli conflict. He's the co-author, together with Dr. Einat Wilf, of The War of Return: How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. Dr. Schwartz is an expert on two of his main research topics: the history of Jews from Arab countries and the Palestinian refugee problem. He holds a PhD from the Department of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University. He holds a BA in history from Tel Aviv University and an MA with distinction in political studies from Bar-Ilan. He's a fellow at the Center for International Communications at the Bar-Ilan University and a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, ISGAP. Adi, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining me. The topic of my lecture today would be Shafiq Adas. And this will be what I will present is part of an ongoing research, which is still in the working. And I hope to be able to continue working it in the near future. So I would like to talk about three different things. I will start with Shafiq Adas himself, his story, his tragic end. Then I would like to put it into context of the Iraqi Jewish community, and then try to draw some comparisons between Jewish experiences in modern times in Arab countries as well as in Europe, because I think there are some similarities. And since we are under the auspices of the London Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, to try to understand some common traits of the anti-Semitic experiences in both Arab countries and in Europe. So I will start, I will just share my screen. I hope you can see the picture. What you see here is the Adas family around 1942. This is a picture I received from the son Sabah. And the man on the left side, that is Shafiq Adas. And Adas himself was born in Aleppo in 1900s. And Aleppo, which we now call Halab, currently in Syria, but then in the Ottoman Empire. And after World War I, in the 20s, Shafiq leaves Aleppo with his brother Abraham and is going to Iraq. Iraq, which just recently became under British rule after World War I. And the regime change, this change from Ottoman Empire to the British Empire, was very significant in the life of Iraq. And I will show you a map, which would be very important in that. I hope you can see the entire map. let's see on my side. This is the Ottoman Empire, most of it at least. And if you can see, if you look at the right hand at the bottom, you see Basra. You see it circled in purple. And as you can see, Basra, which is the place where Shafiq Adas is going to live, it's on the periphery, on the end of the Ottoman Empire. You can see the red border between the Ottoman Empire and Iran. So these provinces of Iraq were really at the end of the Ottoman Empire. And then at the end of World War I, when the British conquer Iraq, and this would be the next map, here you can see Iraq in the center of the sea routes, or in the center of the British Empire, stretching from, as you can see, London and Liverpool in the west, through all the big ports of Europe, Antwerp and Rotterdam, etc., through the Mediterranean and on the route to India. Remember that we're still during the colonial period, the British colonial period, and Basra, again, circled in purple, stands not at the end of the empire, but at the middle of the empire, which means that everybody hoped and aspired that Iraq is going to be prosperous and is going to have many economic and commercial opportunities. And this is the reason why Shafiq and his older brother Abraham moved from Aleppo to Iraq. So the idea is that they're going to be some commercial and economic opportunities, and that is the reason why they're leaving. And you must remember that this is still a very new invention. Iraq is not a very ancient kingdom. What happened at the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire collapses, three provinces, three vilayets, as they were called in the Ottoman days, of Basra in the south, Baghdad in the center, and Mosul in the north, all of these three provinces become the new state of Iraq. So from everything that we know, Shafiq started out as quite a simple man, as a simple mechanic, actually fixing cars. And from what we know, again, his story is a classic story of a self-made man, almost a Hollywood-style story. One day, Henry Ford visits Iraq and wants to open an agency to sell Ford cars. He meets Shafiq, and he decides to give him an exclusive license to sell Ford in Iraq. Now you have to understand, this is the 20s and the 30s. Selling Ford in a new, under British rule area is a huge and very lucrative business. And Shafiq very quickly befriends all the most important people in Iraq, because everybody who was somebody in Iraq then wanted to own a Ford. So this is really the beginning of Shafiq Adas' success, economic success. And he meets politicians, he meets businessmen. This is the way, or this is the method by which Shafiq becomes acquainted with all the most important people in Iraq. But that's not everything. From telephone books that we have from the 30s, already in the 30s, we know that Shafiq Adas was the representative of dozens of European and Western companies, among them insurance companies, construction companies. And as you can understand, when Iraq becomes under British rule, there are a lot of investments, and being that representative of many European countries, again, makes Shafiq Adas a very successful businessman, and he turns to be one of the most or the richest people in Iraq, certainly among the Jewish community. He was then considered at least one of the richest Jews in Iraq, and his business is going very well. Shafiq marries a local Basra woman. So he had, as I said before, his brother Abraham, his older brother, remains in Baghdad, where Baghdad is the administrative and the capital of the new state of Iraq. And Basra, as you can see, is a port city, an extremely important port city, which connects British sea routes and commerce and industry and everything going from the Mediterranean, as you can see, through the Red Sea, through the Indian Sea, and again through the Persian Gulf. So Basra was a key place where export and import came in and out of Iraq, whereas Abraham, the older brother, was located in Baghdad, where the more administrative and the political capital of Iraq, again, was in Baghdad. So he marries Alice, and they have 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. And from what we know, Shafiq Adas was not a very religious person. He was not very well, or he wasn't, seen in synagogues or in all kinds of community events. And from what we know, most of his friends and his acquaintances were Muslim. So he had Muslim businessmen as his, both as his social acquaintances, as his friends. And he was not a very, let's say, inherent part of the Jewish community. We also know, and this would be the next slide that I would like to show, that, just a second. Okay, so these are a few pictures, I hope you can see them, of Basra in the beginning of the 20th century, to give you some impression of how it looks. You see the rivers. This is the Shat el Arab that, after a few kilometers down to the southeast, pours into the Persian Gulf or the Arab Gulf. Okay, and these are 2 very important people. These are the most important politicians of the time. On the left side, you can see Abdel Ilah. This was the regent. Iraq was created as a kingdom. Faisal I was the first king, and Abdel Ilah was the regent, because in the 40s, the king was still a child. So his uncle, Abdel Ilah, as you can see, was the regent. On the right side, you can see Nuri Said, which was practically the most visible and the most important politician in Iraq, I think, until the revolution of 1958. And Shafiq Adas was a friend of both of them. Both of these people were friends, personal friends of Adas. We know that, for example, Nuri Said, his older son was called Sabah, and Shafiq Adas called his son Sabah after the name of Nuri Said. So they were very good friends, and it is known that whenever Abdel Ilah, the regent, visited Basra, he went to visit in the house of Shafiq Adas. So he was very close and very connected to politicians, members of parliament, members of the royal palace. So this is someone who was very well connected and very well, received in the most important and respected circles in Iraq. Now, after the Farhud of 1941, which you can see here, which was basically a pogrom against the Jewish community in the holiday of Shavuot, in the festival of Shavuot in 1941, which deserves a separate and the whole lecture in itself. But after that pogrom against the Jewish community, we see the beginning of organization of some kind of a Zionist movement of self-protection, self-defense among the Jews. And here again, we don't see Shafiq Adas taking part of it. He was not known to be a Zionist. Again, he was not a religious Jew, nor a very national Jew. And I think that in today's jargon, or in today's Western jargon, we'd call him assimilationist. So without very strong either religious or national connections to the Jewish community, but mainly doing his business with his Muslim acquaintances. So the particular events that ended tragically for Shafiq Adas began in August 1948. And this is a period of very high tension in Iraq. War against Israel was declared in May 1948. As you all know, 15th of May, 5 Arab armies attack Israel day after it established its independence. And by August, you could see that Arab armies are not going to succeed. It is quite clear already that the Iraqi army, which took, it was part of the invading armies, it was quite clear that the Iraqi army is going to return to Iraq defeated, and the atmosphere is very tense. People feel humiliated. People cannot understand and cannot grasp how 600,000 Jews are winning against, tens of millions of Arab armies, Arab states, and the tension is very high. Another important point is the relationship between Iraq and the United Kingdom. So Iraq was declared independent in 1932 already, so 16 years earlier. But as in many other cases, the British left Iraq in the sense that Iraq declared independence, but they continued meddling in Iraqi politics, in Iraqi economy, and Iraq and Great Britain were supposed to sign a treaty, again, trying to somehow accommodate British interests in Iraq, and that also caused a lot of anger, a lot of nationalistic anger, and in so many cases in the past, and not only in Iraq, the Jews seemed like the perfect scapegoat to be blamed for everything that's going wrong in Iraq. So we are defeated in the battlefield. We can't persuade the British to, really leave us alone, really be independent. Who is to blame? Jews. It wasn't the first time, and unfortunately, it wasn't the last time. So, what was the method? How do you threaten the Jews? What can you do? So, one of the methods, one of the themes that was that happened a lot in those times was to blackmail rich Jews. So you have to understand that at that time, since May 1948, there's martial law in Iraq. Zionism was declared illegal, and practically every Iraqi Muslim could, or let's say he had a grudge against a Jew, and he could go to the police and accuse him of Zionism. This in itself could bring a lot of problems, arrest, torture on this Jew. And this is exactly what happened to Shafiq Adas, a local editor from a newspaper in Basra. Again, this is the city in the south of Iraq, entered his office, Shafiq Adas' office, and told him, listen, if you're not going to pay 5,000 dinars to me, to bribe me somehow, then I'm going to write a piece in tomorrow's newspaper saying that you're a Zionist and you're a communist. Now, accusations were ridiculous. Again, everybody knew that Shafiq Adas was not Zionist. Everybody knew that he was not a religious Jew. To claim that Shafiq Adas, who ran so many businesses, was a communist was really ridiculous, right? But that was the atmosphere, that you could say anything about a Jew and it would stick. It would simply stick against him. And Shafiq Adas was very proud, was a very actually Iraqi, and he said, okay, I'm very rich. I assume that this is what he told himself. I'm rich. I'm very much connected. How is it possible that this editor would enter my office and would simply tell me what to do? And he told me, he dismissed him. He said, I'm not going to pay. With all due respect, I'm not going to pay. I'm not going to be a victim of your blackmail, etc., etc. And of course, the next day, what happened was that the editor wrote a very big article in a nationalistic Iraqi paper claiming that Shafiq Adas was a Zionist agent, that in fact he helped the Israeli army against the Iraqi army. Now you have to understand, this is a time when there's a state of war. There's open war between Iraq and the state of Israel, and accusing a Jew, helping the Israeli army is basically accusing him of treason at the time of war. So this is very risky. This is, an extremely volatile position. And Adas didn't take it very seriously. He thought that, he's so very well connected, nothing will happen, it will pass. But in fact, it didn't pass. And what happened is that each day, accusations became more and more violent, and not only in Basra, but in Baghdad, and slowly the public opinion in Iraq became very, very harsh and offensive against Shafiq Adas, claiming that he must be arrested, he must be put to trial, and he should be hanged for treason. And Adas himself was told by his friends and even by his Muslim friends, you have to leave. Situation here in Iraq is too dangerous for you. Now, again, Basra is very close to the Persian, to the Iranian border. It was quite easy for Adas, if he only wanted, he could very easily, cross the border and find some kind of a refuge in Iran, at least for perhaps a short period of time. But Adas thought that he's protected, and he couldn't imagine that he would face big troubles. And according to at least one of the accounts, he even went himself to the police and wanted to speak to the officers there to say, what's going on? Why am I being accused? And according to what we know, that was the last time that people saw him outside of the police. This was the last time that he was a free man. And he was arrested, he was tortured, and eventually on 11th of September, so about 1 month after everything began, he was put on trial on in a military court, again saying that he sold equipment to the Israeli army. As I said before, Adas was an agent of many European and Western countries, so he was able, or according to the accusations, he was able to sell old British equipment from the World War II to the Israeli army. Now, again, people knew it was just false accusations. It was quite clear what's going on, but that was it. The trial took 3 days, only 3 days. He couldn't bring any witnesses for the defense, and his lawyers resigned because of that. And he simply remained alone, facing his these allegations. And of course, after 3 days of this mock trial, he was found guilty of treason, of Zionism, and of communism. And his sentence was death by hanging. And he was eventually hanged outside his Basra mansion in September 1948. That day became an anti-Jewish, you could say, festival of hate. There are many descriptions. Almost every Iraqi Jew who wrote later about this period mentions that day, 23rd of September 1948, as one of the most difficult days in the life of Iraqi Jewish community. Live broadcasts, all day long, buses brought from all around Basra to watch the public hanging of the richest Jew. And this is what will happen to the Jew. We must hang Adas, etc., etc. There are very, very difficult, very sad descriptions of that day, of how it became a real festival, a real day of joy for the residents of Basra and of Baghdad that day. How do we know that Adas was innocent? So there are a few reasons for that. First of all, the whole affair started as a blackmail operation. It was not a serious or an honest investigation that someone really found evidence. Again, it started as a blackmail operation that simply, like a snowball, just went and went, became bigger and bigger, and nobody could stop it. And only Adas was put on trial. Adas, in all his dealings, always worked with Muslims. All his companies were co-owned by Muslims. So if really one of his companies really dealt with, some illegal selling of equipment to Israel, how come only he was tried? Why next to him weren't his Muslim co-owners were tried also? So the reason, or the fact that only the Jew found himself accused, again shows that this was an anti-Jewish act much more than a real trial. And we have evidence that the regent himself said that he knows that Adas was innocent. So from British and American documents found in the British and American foreign secretaries, we know that the British and the American ambassadors in Iraq at the time tried to meet senior politicians, among them Nuri Said and Abdulillah that you just saw before, and tried to tell them, listen, you're doing here a very unjust hanging and the death penalty here. Adas is an innocent man, etc., etc. And from their meetings with the regent, we know that the regent said, I know Adas is innocent, but I can't do anything. He was afraid that if he is going to intervene on behalf of Shafiq Adas, there would be a revolution. The public opinion, the army, the press was so, fiercely nationalistic and anti-Jewish. The atmosphere was very toxic and violent against the Jews. The regent felt that there's nothing he can do. If he is going to intervene on behalf of Adas, his fate would be, his body would be hanging next to his. That was the atmosphere, and this is the reason why the regent did not interfere himself. So the question is, why Adas, right? What did they want from him? And on the one hand, one could say or could think that, this was just a coincidence. Perhaps if Adas had paid the ransom, he would not have been arrested. So this is just a tragic turn of events, perhaps avoidable. But on the other hand, it wasn't really a coincidence, and unfortunately, it wasn't really avoidable. It was a height of an anti-Jewish orchestrated campaign by the Iraqi government, together with the Iraqi press, Iraqi army, Iraqi public opinion. And as I said before, these were very tense months in the life of the Iraqi Jewish community, 1948, 1949. And Jews were arrested and tortured. If a letter in Hebrew was found, if a book with the Hebrew letters were found in the house of a Jew, it was enough to arrest him because he would be some kind of an agent of the nascent Jewish state. And these arrests and torture continued well into 1949. It did not stop in 1948. It was impossible for a Jew to leave Iraq at that time, and many Jews were sent to lengthy prison terms. Now, a few months after the case of Shafiq Adas, there was another case of a person named Reuven Batat. Now, Reuven Batat also was a Jew, was a very important jurist, one of the first jurists or judges in Iraq. He was also a member of parliament, and he also was accused of being a Zionist agent. As an old man, he was sent to prison. His health deteriorated very much during his time in prison. He was released, but then died after a very short period. So you understand that this was not a coincidence. This was not a sole case of just, taking revenge against Shafiq Adas, the person, but he was the embodiment of a very strong Jew, a very rich Jew, a very powerful Jew with very strong connections. And it was a climax or the peak of an entire anti-Jewish campaign. Now, how did this tragic end of Shafiq Adas influence the Jewish community? I think that the most common reaction was of shock, complete shock, because people said, if the Iraqi state can do this to, one of our finest sons or one of our strongest and most powerful member of community, what's going to happen to me? You know, as a Jew, I'm just a simple Jew. I run a grocery store or whatever. And if a strong and connected person like Adas could be hanged just like that outside his house, what would be my fate? And, you know, as I said before, in the beginning, Adas was not a very known member of the community, but when his trial started, the entire Jewish community became aware of that and, you know, started supporting him and indeed seeing him as a Jew. Before the trial, he was not very known and had many connections, but when the trial started, everybody was looking and was afraid to see what's going on. I'd like to read to you a few very short examples of seeing how Iraqis themselves saw this. So, for example, Eli Amir, right, the writer who wrote the very famous The Dove Flyer, the story of Shafiq Adas is the beginning of his book. This is how he starts his book, and he says about Shafiq Adas the following. He says, "The fate of Shafiq Adas kept me awake. One spin of fortune's wheel, and even a muhtashem like him, a potentate at the height of his career, was just another Jew at the end of a rope." And one or more two examples, again, only from contemporary Iraqi writers. Yitzhak Bar Moshe, also a writer, an author, a journalist, he said that from then on, meaning from the hanging of Shafiq Adas, from then on, there was only one way forward. No longer did anyone ask why or wherefore. Jews spoke about mass emigration. From that day on, not a single Jew thought otherwise. And another example, Salim Fatal, also a journalist, documentarist, filmmaker, Iraqi-born, said that Adas' staged trial was understood as the trial of the whole Jewish community and as symbolic of how its fate was sealed. Iraq was clearly telling all its Jews, you do not belong. You no longer have a place among us. Now, of course, just remember that the Iraqi Jewish community is 2,000 or more than 2,000 years old, one of the oldest, richest, and most important Jewish communities, certainly in the Middle East, but also around the world, preceding the Arabs and Islam in more than 1,000 years, but eventually they were shown the way out. Now, the most affected and the most harmed were exactly that assimilationist elite, those people who went through what we could call an Iraqization process, meaning that they learned perfect Arabic, they tried to be more Iraqi than Iraqis, and as in so many cases, as in so many other cases around the world. And these people were not Zionists. They did not want to leave Iraq, and some were communists, some were nationalists. There were all kinds of assimilationist Jews in Iraq, but they saw their future in Iraq. They saw that they are indeed Iraqis, that they are part and parcel of the Iraqi new state. And just like in many other places in the Middle East and in Europe, Zionists were a tiny minority before the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, in the year 1950, 1951, some 95% of the Iraqi Jewish community left, mainly for Israel. And it started to be possible in March 1950. And for 12 months, until March 1951, some 95% of the Jewish community left Iraq. And the trial of Shafiq Adas is always mentioned together with the Farhud that you can see on the screen as a main reason and dramatic event for those people who decided to leave Iraq. Now, I want to say a few words about the trajectory of Jews in Arab countries, and I think that here we have some similarities usually overlooked with other communities in Europe which had similar experiences in modern times. And for centuries on centuries, Jews, both in the Middle East and in Europe, suffered legal discrimination and sometimes real physical persecution. And during the 19th century, again, both in Europe and in the Middle East, for the first time, Jews gain official legal equality. In Europe, mainly after the French Revolution, but during the 19th century, Jews all around Europe start becoming what we call the emancipation of the Jews, becoming equal citizens, at least legally, at least officially. In the world of the Middle East and under the Ottoman Empire, this also happens during the 19th century and through the end of the 19th century and the 20th century. So the what we call the Tanzimat reforms of the Ottoman Empire, under those reforms, Jews for the first time gain legal equality with their Muslim neighbors. And this is the time when Jews start, thriving and becoming very, very visible in the cities. This is the time where you start seeing the communities of Baghdad, of Cairo, of Alexandria, of so many other places, of Tripoli, so many other big cities around in the Middle East. You see Jews becoming an urban community. You see them starting secular education, mainly through the Alliance network, studying languages. You see Jewish doctors, lawyers, academics, journalists, filmmakers all around the Middle East, in Egypt, in Iraq. This perhaps was the golden age. Some of the best authors in Iraq, for example, were Jews. There's an interesting story showing, on the one hand, the success of the Jews, but on the other hand, how it was perceived by the Muslim majority. So I forgot the name, but one Iraqi Jew had such a perfect Arabic and spoke, so he knew how to speak in prose, etc. So when King Faisal I died, he was invited to his funeral to recite one of his poems. Now you can imagine what a magnificent and important event, the funeral of the first king of Iraq, and a Jew is able to is one of the poets who is invited to talk. And when he ends his talk, comes to him a Muslim friend, and he tells him, listen, you speak such a beautiful Arabic, such a pity that you're a Jew. So on the one hand, you can see how well accepted and how well, or at least the efforts that the Jews did in order to become part, of the Iraqi society, and on the other hand, how they were still seen as Jews. So on the one hand, you can see how they joined the environment, but on the other hand, there was a backlash against them. The equality of the Jews, or the attempt of the Jews to become equal, was regarded as an offense against Islam and against tradition. Because for something like 1,000 years from the beginning of Islam, Jews were regarded as dhimmi. They were regarded as a tolerated but inferior segment of society, and they were under the protection of the Muslim ruler, but with an inherent inferior position. So Jews being equal to Muslims, which was the innovation of the 19th and the 20th century, and in a sense, the success of Shafiq Adas was the product of that success, right? Of that product of those opportunities of openness, of becoming, a successful businessman. But on the other hand, being equal to Muslims and all these opportunities opening was an affront to more than 1,000 years of doctrine and of practice. And to sum it up, there are a lot of theories about the reasons for the exodus of Jews from Arab countries. Some people say that it was pure Zionism, Jews simply wanted to leave for Israel, and they did so the moment they could. Other peoples accuse the Mossad, for example, of ruining the lives of Jews, conspiring against them, and forcing them to leave. There's also this narrative going on in Iraq that somehow the Israeli Mossad caused and stirred unrest that caused the Jews to leave or to depart from Iraq. And other people say that Jews lived perfectly with their Arab neighbors, and only Zionism and the creation of Israel ruined it all. But I think that the story of Shafiq Adas tells us a different story. It highlights, on the one hand, the life of a community that, when given the opportunity, did everything it could to prosper and integrate. They tried and wanted to be Iraqis, but they were shown the way out. They did not want to leave, but were forced out. And expulsion is just the harshest way to show someone the way out. Not everywhere in the Middle East, Jews were physically expelled. In some places, yes, but not everywhere. But they were given the message that this is not their home. This is not their place, and that they would never be considered equal to Muslims. And I think that this is the right context to understand the exodus of Jews from Arab countries. And since, again, we are here talking in the context of the London Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, I think there are many similarities, or you could really talk about a modern Jewish experience in the 19th and 20th century around the world, mainly in Europe and in the Middle East, of Jewish communities trying to do everything they could to integrate into the surrounding society, and unfortunately being shown the way out. And the case of Shafiq Adas, I think, is, with its tragic end, is one such very prominent example. And with this, I conclude my description and lecture of Shafiq Adas, and I would be very happy and to welcome your questions or comments and to hear your feedback.
Adi, thank you very much. Could I ask you to stop sharing your screen so that we can see the participants?
Sure.
So if you have questions, I see people are starting to raise their hands. Please use the raise hand function. I'm going to use my privilege as the moderator and ask the first question, because what comes to my mind when I hear this story, and I first read it, I think, in a Israeli publication, then in Tablet, and these connections keep coming up for me. This specificity around specifically the accusation of Jews being Zionist agents, not just Jews being expelled, but specifically the use of this accusation of a Jew being a Zionist agent. And what I'm thinking about is that in fact, exactly at this time, around 48, right, late 40s, early 50s, we have Stalin's anti-cosmopolitan campaign and the Doctor's Plot, where the accusation of being a Zionist agent is deployed against Jewish intellectuals. And then I'm also thinking about Poland in 68, when the anti-Zionist campaign was directed specifically against Jews who were so fully integrated into the Polish society, completely assimilated, and there weren't that many of them left anyway after the Holocaust. And this was just so tragic that these Jews who thought that they were fully part of the Polish society are expelled on accusations of being Zionist agents. And so what I think about when I hear this story is, to me, the story that you are telling and the stories that I study show that kind of the undermine the arguments about whether anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are the same. To me, this argument works in theory, but when it gets to practical, actual, real life, we have really well documented historical cases where these accusations, anti-Zionism really becomes straight out anti-Semitism. And so I wonder if you've thought about that and what you think about this.
Yes, I completely agree, because exactly at that time, the distinction between Jews and Zionists was erased totally. All the Jewish community in Iraq was considered to be Zionist. That's it. Now, first of all, everybody knew that this is ridiculous. There was indeed a tiny Zionist movement, but again, just as in many other European countries, ardent Zionists who were really, meeting and talking about one day going to Israel and even doing something, in real life, they were a tiny minority. It existed in Iraq. We know there was even an underground. We know that the Jewish agency was operating in Iraq, mainly after the Farhud. You must remember that the worst pogrom in Iraqi Jewish community happened in 1941. And when Jews understood that they were so defenseless and everything could happen, members of the Haganah from then the Yishuv, what we call, went to Baghdad and Basra and started teaching people how to use guns, how to try to defend themselves. But this was, again, a very small segment of society. Most people did not want to be associated with it. And when you read all the memoirs and all the, the descriptions of how Iraqi Jews saw themselves, many of them really wanted to remain in Iraq. You must remember, Baghdad was a much more sophisticated and developed city than most of the state of Israel. This is also important to remember. But there was no distinction anymore. The entire Jewish community. So you're exactly right. This is what I'm saying, that there were, people tend to think that you have the European Jewish history, and you have what's called now Afro-Asian Jewish history. Of course, it's different because the Christian world is different from the Muslim world, etc. There are many differences. It's true. Thank God we didn't have, what happened in Europe in the 20th century did not happen happily in the Middle East. But I'm saying that there are many, many similarities in the trajectory of both how the Jews saw themselves, doing everything they could, and on the other hand, in the reaction of the surrounding society. So there's a backlash. On the one hand, society opens to Jews, but when Jews start really, appearing in the business, becoming visible, then all of a sudden there's a backlash. That, actually, we didn't really mean that you be, French, German, Austrian, Hungarian, Iraqi, Egyptian. So I see a lot of similarity, which I think has to be more acknowledged.
I agree. And I'll just add that in the 70s and 80s in the Soviet Union, a Jew could be easily accused, just like in your story, of being a Zionist. And this whole idea that this was, that the Mossad was operating behind the scenes, that kind of conspiracy theory was very much present there as well. So I do think that, comparatively speaking, we need to do more of comparative history of these kinds of developments. So again, if you have questions, please raise your hand. Did you want to say something else?
No.
Okay. So Ephraim Nissan has a question. Please go ahead.
Yes, actually, I have much relevant information, but I confine myself just to tell a couple of anecdotes. My mother was the daughter of a man who, as a young officer, had been one of the 3 officers called to declare the first king. For that reason, she was one of those who were privileged. But at one time when she was studying at the Conservatory of Music, at which School of Drama they were fascist, and in the 70s we saw 2 of them in Milan at the International Fair, actually she passed in the street, and she saw the Jews queuing in order to be bused to the internment camp, where, stripped of their nationalities and assets, they were waiting for months to be deported. And she saw, while she was passing, a taxi, a cab, just standing there parked, and not the driver, but the man with him, who was a passenger wearing a turban, was saying, God was watching and saying, God is sending all of them to Palestine in order to kill all of them there. And that is still the narrative. And the other anecdote actually is from the other side. I used to work at the university in Beersheba, and in the 90s, at the shul I attended, at the Bet Knesset, there was Shalom Oz, who was so old that he had been in the Shomer, and he arrived to Hebron right after the massacre of 1929. And actually, he was asked to be an undercover agent in the Arab side. He had sympathy with them. He didn't hate them. But he said, for example, there was a time when a lorry load of Jewish youngsters was arriving from Iraq, and they had to smuggle them in. And you know that the British would let any Arab gang come into this country, but not Jews. So what happened? They said that these were Arab volunteers coming to massacre the Jews. And they came to the bridge on the river Jordan, and there was a soldier. He fainted, he didn't see anything. And then actually the lorry passed, and this man, Shalom Oz, was the one who was taking the lorry with him. And they lodged them for the night. And after a few nights, they had them work at a factory. After a few nights, they had them leave and they go to a kibbutz. And then there was somebody there who was asking them, what happened to those youngsters who had come? He told them the Jews threw them into the river. I don't think it was a good idea, but at any rate, that was a way that a group of Jews was let into the country. If you came as a militiaman to fight against the Jews, you were not barred entry in 1948, a few months before the end of British rule. Instead, if you are Jewish, you had to resort to some trick like that. My own theory is that there is a big relation between what happened to the Armenians and also the Nestorians in Anatolia and what later happened in the Arab world. The Arabs were not culpable for what the Turks and the Turkish Kurds and also some Circassians did to the Armenians and Nestorians. But after that, actually there was a community of Armenians in Baghdad, part of them refugees. But when it came to the Jews trying to have their national home, then the same blueprint that acted against the Armenian was enacted in the Arab world against the Jews. And let us remember that both Germany, Hitler mentioned it, who remembers the Armenians? And one of his closest collaborators actually saw the massacre of the Armenians. First he was against it, and then he was convinced. Not only that, there was the Turks who had an act of parliament that for exactly 1 year in 1915 said deport the Armenians. There was a slogan, they can live in the desert but nowhere else. And that probably was taken from the 1904 genocide of the Herero in Namibia on the part of the Germans, where they did exactly that. They brought the population in the desert and they died of starvation. Thank you. I have finished.
Thank you so much. Adi, do you want to comment on anything that Ephraim said? Otherwise, we'll move to the next question.
Perhaps we can move to the next, and then if I'll have some comments in the end, then I will.
Perfect. That sounds good. Tammy Peterson, please.
Hello, Adi. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really informative. Recently, I did a class on Muslims and the Holocaust, which covered a lot of the sort of newer, I'm doing a PhD in Holocaust and genocide studies, and it covered some of the newer information coming out about the Holocaust in North Africa in particular. Obviously, Iraq is somewhat of a different story, but my question really pertains to when it came to questions of assimilation in places after the Holocaust, like Poland, where you had the Kielce program and other pogrom and other things that were going on. You saw a rise in Zionism, right? And people saying that we can't be assimilated in these countries. We have to leave. And so why was it that they didn't see it in the same way in Iraq? Why was there kind of like a trust that same thing was not going to happen, especially after the Farhud in 1941, that what was going on with European Jewry wasn't going to happen? Why didn't the Holocaust act as more of a warning to the people there?
Well, it's a very good question. It's always the question of, when's the right moment to leave, right? When do you know that you have to go? And many people, unfortunately, make not so good decisions. But I must tell you something, in 1951, some 95% of the community left, but 5% remained. And you know that one of the astonishing facts is that the widow of Shafiq Adas remained in Iraq. Now, I don't know exactly, as I said in the beginning, this is still a research in progress, so I can't still tell you exactly why they remained in Iraq, but the fact is that they remained in Iraq. And I'll tell you more than that.
In 19...
Sorry? No, it's good. Okay,
No,
so
please continue. I think it was just somebody's mic off. Go ahead.
Okay, so as you see, even after the Farhud, Tammy, even after the Farhud, and even after what happened to Shafiq Adas, and even after everything that happened, still 5%. And by the way, they were the more prosperous people who still had businesses in Iraq remained in the 50s, in the 60s. They remained even after Saddam Hussein came to power. I know some people in Israel who still had the pleasure of visiting and spending some time in the torture prisons of Saddam Hussein. And the interesting story, for example, is that one of them, an example of an assimilationist Iraqi Jew remained in Iraq until the 70s. And in 1969, again, some, I think, 9 or 11 Jews were hanged. Again, treason, aiding the Zionist, agents, etc. This was, again, after the 6-day war. And still some Jews remained in Iraq. And that same person that I'm telling you about wrote a poem about how he feels protected as a Jew under the auspices of a Muslim ruler. So I don't know what to tell you. Is this self-deception? Is this an illusion that we can still succeed? I don't know the answer. I can tell you that some of it is a very Jewish phenomenon. Even when the earth is burning, you still contemplate whether this is the right moment, etc., etc. Again, we know it from other people. But just a little bit more specifically to the Iraqi context, it is true that the Farhud was really a very tragic event, but the Farhud happened in a moment in Iraqi history when the British, Britain was kind of ruling the area, even though Iraq was already independent. There was a coup by pro-German, pro-Nazi, very nationalistic, by the way, aided by the Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was then living in Baghdad. But when order was restored and the British returned to Iraq, the years 1941 until 1945 were quiet for the Jews in Iraq, and even more than that, were good times in terms of economy. You know that the war, especially when Iraq was ruled by the British, and again, Iraq was a very important area between India and Singapore and Hong Kong, all the very important British outposts in Asia, through the Persian Gulf, their bases in Cyprus, in Malta, in Gibraltar. So if you look at the British Empire, the years 1941, 1945, if you are a businessman, if you are dealing with import and export in Iraq, you're having a good time. So actually, 1941 to 1945 was a good time for the economy of Iraq. So you understand, people tend to forget easily or more easily when time becomes, when they become prosperous. And of course, they didn't go through the experience of what happened in Europe. They were, of course, aware of that, but it's different when you just read in the papers and etc. And I think there was always the hope. There was always the hope. When you read Iraqi leaders of the community, you're astonished how Iraqi they really felt themselves. They felt themselves as they were the indigenous people of Iraq. They were more indigenous in their view than the Muslims. They were more indigenous than the Arabs. They were the sons of Babylonia. They were holding the torch of 2.5 millennia from the Babylonian Talmud and the whole history of the Geonim, and the big yeshivot of Pompedita and all that. So for them, it was a huge shock to leave Iraq. Was they were really Iraqis. We now, 2023, in retrospect, it looks bizarre. We now have the state of Israel for 75 years. So you say, okay, why didn't they come here? It sounds like so natural. But back then, it wasn't like that. And again, you must remember that not only Baghdad, but Cairo and Alexandria were so much more developed than, with all due respect, Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, in 1948 or in 1940s. Casablanca, all these cities were so more important. And so nowadays, Israel is a prosperous and strong country. So it seems only natural that, you want to immigrate from Iraq to Israel. But back then, it wasn't that clear at all.
Ephraim.
Yes, I just wanted to say about that poem after the hanging of the 11 in 1969. It was Anwar Shaul who left and went to Israel after.
Exactly.
And the reason was he just calling for mercy. I am under the protection of the Ummah, the nation of Islam.
Exactly. That is the poem that I was referring to. Exactly.
Yes, and the wife of Shafiq Adas, she left in 1952. She was standing in the queue before my mother, and the official who was reading her passport, because she was one of the few who were given a passport, was reading the color of the mustache just to insult her. Lona Shawared, that is the color of the mustache.
Okay,
Yes.
Well, thank you. Adi, do you have anything to say about that?
No, I mean,
just a hint that may help, perhaps. I remember that in the 90s, Ian Duncan Smith here in London spoke at the Commons about the medical case in hospital of Mrs. Adas, and I suspect that by age, she was the widow of Adas. If you are looking for her, that may be a lead.
Yeah, no, I know that she emigrated to Canada. She
Yes.
lived in, I mean, actually, she moved, she left Iraq in the beginning of the 60s, first to England, but then to Montreal. And some of the members of the Adas family still live in Canada, in Montreal. And I mean, most of his family actually is in Montreal.
Yes.
And astonishingly, since I just had the chance to reach them just recently, the family is still very much in shock of those events, and never really came to terms, never really processed it, never tried to commemorate or to do, you know, many times the family is trying to write books, have conferences, evenings. This was a very dramatic event in the life of the Iraqi Jewish community, and they were simply, you know, closing into themselves, never talking about it. And they said a sentence that was really very strong to me. They said that Adas himself died once, but they died 1,000,000 times, over and over again. So this was
very
a really
difficult to
very tragic.
encapsulate.
Excuse me, Ephraim, may I ask, we have a question from somebody else. I just want to give the floor to someone else. Thank you so much. So this is a question from Tony Cummins. I hope I'm not mispronouncing the name. It's come through the chat. So the question for Adi: in the early 1970s, when I was in graduate school and starting out as a journalist, I did some reporting on a Mrs. Odile Dalal. If you're familiar with her story, her visit from Iraq to the United States, would you comment on that?
No, actually, I don't know Odile Dalal. I know Dalal family. I know a member of the family living in Israel. And this was the woman that I talked about before, because they remained in Iraq until the 70s, imagine. And her father was arrested by the Saddam Hussein regime. And by the way, do you know that some of the Jews were arrested and tortured in the Abu Ghraib prison, which many years later, you know, it was a big scandal when the Bush administration, you know, the 2003 war in Iraq, there was a scandal of pictures of abuse of you remember that scandal? So that was the same prison. So imagine being there many years before and tortured by soldiers of Saddam Hussein. So I know another Dalal family. I'm not familiar with the Odile family, but I know that the Dalal family remained in Iraq in the 70s. And yeah, this is what I can add about that.
Okay, well, it looks like we don't have any more questions or comments. Adi, thank you so much for this fascinating talk, and people can read it in Tablet Magazine, and I don't know if you're going to publish it anywhere else, this story, and we look forward to hearing more of your research as it comes through. And we look forward to seeing everyone at the next meeting, at the next seminar that we're going to hold. And please do donate and do support us. And thank you so much for joining. Adi, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you very much for having me, and good evening, everyone.